Hello, and welcome to our next presentation. This is day 3 of the final day of the symposium. And on behalf of the MIT CDOIQ Virtual Symposium, we would like to thank all our sponsors who have sponsored the symposium this year. Please keep a lookout for a very special survey that we'll be sending out shortly. In the meantime, let me thank our sponsors, Deloitte, Informatica, Privacy Analytics, DAWIX, Fusion Alliance, KPMG, Santel Consultants, Tamer, Elation, Ali Data, Big ID, Boomi, Caserta, Citizen, Data Kitchen, Garage, Okira, Pylog, Click, ThoughtSpot, Eckerson, Global ID, Snowflake, and Starburst. Please take a chance to go to Content Hub, see what content they have, download that, and if you get a chance, reach out to our partners. Without our partners, we would not be able to hold a symposium. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in 2021.
Welcome. I'm very excited to be the producer of this panel. These are 3 of my favorite thought leaders in the community, especially Dr. Madnick. Today, Jim Short is going to be the moderator of a panel on ethics, decisions, and trust in AI systems of the future. What if humans can't agree? And Dr. Jim Short is a lead scientist at San Diego Supercomputer Center at UC San Diego. He is a data scientist interested in the economics of large-scale data systems, the valuation of data in information markets, and the economic incentives and management of data privacy and data sharing. In 2018, he founded SDSC's new blockchain research laboratory, Block Lab. The lab's his current work focus on the economies and policy governance of data markets. Dr. Short received his undergraduate, master's, and Ph.D. degrees from MIT. It's my sincere pleasure to pass the conversation over to Dr. Short. Jim, you're on mute. There you go.
So good day, everyone. We're on the last day of a conference that we've all participated in, I think many of you over the years. And we have 2 panelists today who are both colleagues, professional colleagues, and friends. So I think at the end of a 3-day conference, we can cover the ground that we want to cover intellectually, but we can also ask questions that pertain to a topic area that is much discussed today, but we're evolving in our thinking of it. So think of this session as both thought-provoking, but also grounded in what some experts, who I'll introduce here right now, have been also thinking about what we should be doing. So I'm pleased to introduce our 2 speakers, Professor Stuart Madnick, and anyone who has attended MIT CDOIQ over the years will know that Stu and his colleague, Dr. Rich Wang, founded this conference. So Stu, thank you, and thank you for joining on this session. Very important. I'd also like to introduce Mr. Stephen Orrin, Chief Technology Officer from Intel. Steve has thought carefully about how this topic area is evolving, and many of the companies that he's also been looking at in terms of AI. So we read a lot about this topic: trust, confidence, where we're going to deploy AI, how it is being deployed, who will deploy it. And the question in the end, intellectually, is how much of our decision-making is going to be human judgment, which is a topic we'll get to here in a second, and how much of it is going to be machine and calculated. That will be a trade-off and maybe something that we can expand on in our discussion today. Our session flow, let me just spend a second on session flow, and then I will turn this to Steve. So Steve will get us started and talk a little bit about where AI is being deployed. What are the opportunity areas that businesses, government organizations, educational institutions are looking at with respect to artificial intelligence? In short, how big a problem is this and where at this current stage? And what are we going to do about that? I'll then ask Professor Madnick to explain some of the work that he's been doing in this, and including an article that he's written looking at the question of, well, in data and in artificial intelligence, and you're presenting complex information or automating decisions, what if the humans that are involved in the process don't agree? That is a topic that I think we should spend some time on this afternoon. We'll then do some questions that we've thought about that you may be interested in a very short discussion, and then we'll open it up. And at the end of a conference, I hope there will be many and questions that we can get from what basically we're talking about and make some progress on that. So Steve, ready? Over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. And give me a moment to get this into share. There we go. So what I thought we'd do is start off with a little bit about some of the foundational things around AI, just to sort of lay the groundwork of where things can go wrong. We should know what we're talking about. And first and foremost is to understand that analytics, machine learning, and AI, these use cases and these technologies span really every industry, from interactions in our day-to-day consumer lives to healthcare and finance, to government, transportation, industrial, and into big science as well. And we're seeing it permeate every aspect of our lives. And the use cases are both fun and interesting as far as the searching the web or getting the music that you think you're going to like, autonomous vehicles and driving, to much more important things like being able to quickly identify cancer in scans, be able to identify threats in real time, and be able to track fraud and money laundering. These are the kinds of things that AI and machine learning is being applied to. But we must also recognize that it's not a one size fits all. There are multiple approaches to analytics and AI, and the terms often get used interchangeably, but I think there's a distinction that needs to be understood between things like deep learning, big data analytics, machine learning, and other kinds of AI. You'll find that there's concepts like supervised and unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning, and federated learning. And then within each one of those, you'll find specific subsets and sub-niches like speech and natural language processing, image and object recognition, change detection. Some of the more recent research that's generating a lot of buzz is things around adversarial networks and deep fakes. All of these come together to really provide a variety of rich capability to apply these techniques to a variety of those use cases. And so when you're dealing with a specific use case, and I'm going to pick on the smart factory, which is part of the Industry 4.0 activities, it's not, well, what AI, let's apply AI everywhere. It's applying the right AI and the right machine learning to the right problems. And a lot of that is dictated by what is the outcomes you're going after? What are you trying to accomplish? So it starts with the question. In this case, how many parts do you need to manufacture? And looking at AI analytics around the historical supply and demand and be able to find those trends to be able to predict what you should do for your inventory. Versus something like machine learning that can be applied to the question of what will our production yield be? And looking at the various different variables that are related to yield across the complex factory cycles. And then you would apply things like deep learning to be able to do real-time image recognition of defects at scale and at speed. And then you can also look at a different kind of deep learning to look at the actual mechanics of things like the robotic arms. And is there ways to get better efficiencies about how it's using? So when you start looking at applying AI to a particular set of use cases or a particular industry, it really is a diverse set of capabilities that you can bring to bear. And it gets even more interesting when we look at the overall life cycle and understanding that AI is truly interdisciplinary. At its core, it starts with data. The generation and creation and acquisition of data from sensors, being able to ingest that data into the systems, to transmit it, to integrate it, to normalize it, to be able to enable the machine learning and the analytics and AI. None of that happens without data, and making sure that you have the right data for the right questions to be asked. And then applying the various different machine learning and AI techniques. And sometimes it's not just a one or the other. There are fusion methodologies to be able to bring the best of different worlds together. Image recognition combined with machine learning, combined with analytics, to ultimately get to the outcomes you're looking for, to the insights, whether it be business, operational, security, or otherwise. But I think one of the most important things, and this will be the topic of a lot of our conversation today, is understanding that as we use these technologies and as they make their way into every aspect of our lives, there's some fundamental questions we have to ask about them. Step one, we have to understand the life cycle. Where does this AI or this capability come from? And the reality is, it's not always just a box that you put into an environment and flip on. It's not a piece of software that just magically starts working. There's a life cycle to AI. There's a life cycle to just the data part of AI, where the data sets came from, where the training data sets, where the inferencing data sets, what happened to that data in transit, who's been in control or ownership of that data, and how is the integrity of that data. The models that are being generated, the weighting that's being applied, all of those that go into a question of, well, how do I trust these mechanisms? How do I have proper governance across the life cycle? And how do I implement these securely from end to end across the entire AI lifecycle? These are fundamental questions because it's important to note that things can go wrong at every step of the process, both unintentional and intentional. Data bias is a hot topic right now. And understanding that bias can be inadvertently introduced at every stage, whether it be the data sets that we use for training, the integration points and fusion points, to the actual building of the models and the application of the weights, to the questions that even get asked. And that's something that as we talk about later today, we should really think about. Making sure to ask the right questions, and I don't want to steal some of Stu's thunder, is fundamental to getting the right answers and getting any answer out of an AI system. So we have to recognize that these AI machine learning analytic systems are built on top of a life cycle that is driven by data, and that we need to build in the security, trust, and governance mechanisms underneath in the systems and infrastructure to truly enable AI. But the open question that we will talk about today is, well, what is that security, trust, and governance needed? And how do I apply it? And where do I need it? So with a little bit more about some of these interesting conversations, I'd like to pass the torch over to Stu to talk about a little bit about these issues.
Okay, I hope we're transmitting okay. It was easy to hear Steve. I can't hear myself, so I can't tell. So hopefully you're hearing me.
We can hear you loud and clear. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So I want to be a little bit more, even more provocative if I can. And this is something I often like to do with a live audience. So I apologize for not being able to see your expressions, but I want to confront what I consider to be a very plausible challenge that any one of you might face in your organization at some time, and see why it raises a lot of issues regarding what do we want to do, and in particular what I call the ethics of the issue. So let me set kind of the scenery for you. Unfortunately, given the virus situation, most of us are not traveling very much, so I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey. So first thing I want to give you the setting. I want you to put yourself in the position of the developer of software for autonomous vehicles. And of course, you must arrange for the system to do all of the appropriate decisions. In this particular case, the setting I have in mind is this is the vehicle coming down a Swiss mountain. And as it turns a sharp corner, you remember these vehicles are very smart. They have a lot of intelligence on them, all kinds of sensors. So that's called object identification. It can recognize, for example, that there is a woman with a baby carriage coming into the crosswalk on the right-hand side. The system's also able to recognize that there are three gentlemen coming onto the crosswalk from the left-hand side. And the system is also able to identify that there are concrete barriers on both sides of the wall. Now, it turns out the system also is smart enough to know that given the speed it's traveling at, having made that turn, given the nature of the pavement it's traveling on, given the distances involved, it knows that even if it were to activate the brakes at this instant, it would not be able to stop soon enough. So now the question is, which of those three options does the car do? Does it continue along the path, hitting that poor lady and the baby? Does it veer a little bit to the left and hit those gentlemen? Or does it veer sharply to the right or left, banging into the walls? In either case, there is serious consequences. Now, if this was a live audience, I'd often ask for a show of hands regarding which of those three choices, because this is not the Jetsons. The car cannot take off and fly away. One of those three things will happen. The only issue is which one will the system choose to do? Now, I find trying to make that decision drives people crazy. So what I do instead is said, let us at least discuss why we might not like each of those decisions. For example, what would be wrong with continuing along the path? Well, hitting that poor mother and baby, who knows, that baby might grow up to become president or a great inventor. And of course, it's pretty bad PR to be reported as deliberately killing a woman and a baby and a mother. The second option, to veer to the left and hitting the gentleman, violates what's often called the utilitarian theory of ethics, that says, given a choice, it's better to kill one or two people than to kill three people. And then option number three, which is the one most of us often like to state because it makes us feel good, and that is have the driver veer to the left or right in killing himself. But think of it this way. Imagine you're the manufacturer of the car and you have to put a sticker on the windshield that says, if necessary, this car will kill you. And from an ethical point of view, shouldn't protecting the driver be the number one priority? Now, as I said at the beginning, there is no one right answer. And that's the real thing I try to point out to my students. I'm an engineer by training. Many of you also are engineers or computer scientists. I always like the fact that 2 + 2 is 4, not 3.9, not 4.1. That might work up the river at Harvard, but at MIT, 2 + 2 is 4. We like to have nice, clear answers. Unfortunately, when we're dealing with many circumstances, in particular, many of the circumstances that AI systems will have to deal with, there is no perfect right answer that we all can agree with. So that's the challenge. What do we do in those circumstances where we can't all agree upon the answer? We'll come back to this and other examples later, but I want you to think about this and how you would approach these matters and how you would come up, in particular, not just a matter of coming up with the decision you'd make, but the question is, what would be the logic behind it? Now, to tie this into the CDO conference, and as Steve stressed so nicely, so much of what AI systems do is based upon the data we use, but there's lots of challenges involving the data we use. The data can be ambiguous. For example, there are, what did I say here? Oh, yes. I don't know how many of you have been following this, and the keynote speaker on the first day was very good, talking about Johns Hopkins and the COVID-19 data analysis and so on. But there's so much ambiguity around the world. For example, I believe in Italy, they only count a death as being a COVID death if the person dies in a hospital. I may have my facts wrong, but that at least is one story I heard. So exactly what you count and how you count it can be very, and particularly if you try and look at data globally around the world, and if each country has a different semantics what the data means, then how do you make sense of it and make the right decisions? Obviously, some of the data involves subjective judgments. In some sense, trying to decide which of the three choices the car has is a form of subjective choices. There's often incomplete data we have to deal with, and there can be biases in the data. I believe one story I heard was some AI vision systems when shown various pictures, would identify black people as being gorillas because the training set it had happened to have that as a characteristic, and it kind of logically came to the conclusion anybody who looks dark must be a gorilla. So there can be biases, not deliberate biases, but just in the choice of the data we have, there are biases. So I'm going to stop here, but I want to point these out because these are decisions. They won't be made by themselves. You and your company and governments have a responsibility to say, how do we use these AI systems in the way that they have the best and desired results? What are the consequences? Not just the ethical consequences that I'm bringing up, but there are legal and business consequences. And if you think about it, and as Steve stressed so well, these are all data related. And in my mind, the CDO, the Chief Data Officer, clearly should be front and center on these matters. Thank you. I hope this has gotten a little bit provocative, and I look forward to discussing these and other issues with you. I think, Steve, you have to unmute. Okay.
So, Stu, thank you. You accomplished the goal of providing a provocative example and setting up the discussion about how we can balance technical criteria, ethical judgment, and practical utility, utilitarianism. For kind of setting the landscape. So you've raised the question, and we're raising the question about how we're going to respond to these and who in the organizations are going to take decision responsibility for providing a map of how that works. So we read that many are setting up coordinative mechanisms, partnerships, activities that are sort of presaging a decision criteria that would be circulated. Steve, you've given some thought to this and have talked a lot with other parts of organizations that you've been working with about how they're thinking about these kinds of partnerships. Could you kind of give us a few examples of what some of them may be looking like?
So as you mentioned, and as Stu also mentioned, fundamentally, it comes down to sort of three parts. Number one is transparency and traceability. Understanding where the AI systems or the data sets that they're using for those AI systems are coming from. And that responsibility typically falls into either the CDO office if an organization has such, or the data architecture office. But one of the things that I've seen most recently is that success is not just, well, we have a CDO, we're done. It's about whether or not that city organization is adequately partnered and in tandem with the line of business that's actually driving whatever the AI solution or problem set that they're going after. The governance and security, both from an IT security as well as from a legal compliance perspective, is pulling the teams together in collaboration is where we see success happening. So knowing not just what we're trying to accomplish, but what are the rules of engagement? What are the right supply chains for those AI and those AI capabilities, and bringing that together so that you can develop a corporate or at least a strategic governance methodology for deploying the analytics and AI in the appropriate way. But it all starts back again, as we've mentioned a couple of times here, is with the data and understanding where that data set's coming from. In the example that Stu mentioned, it wasn't a malicious, it was just that the data sets they had done their training on and taken the model from were divorced from what the actual the outcomes they were looking. They were looking for human identification. They had a data set that was incomplete, but they didn't know that. And I think that's, again, where there's traceability. So it falls to a chief data officer or their organization, but they can't do it in a vacuum. And so I think where we've seen success is where the CDO organization proactively reaches out to both the line of business that's driving the use case, but also the different other aspects of the organization to pull in what's necessary to provide the right side of oversight and the right decision making.
So let's continue this line of thought here. So we're developing partnerships. So Steve, you started out by laying out a lot of application areas where AI potentially could be deployed. That implies that we may have a lot of these things organizing, not a few. And as companies start to ramp up, we have a question of scale, and we have a question of what kind of coordinative mechanism is going to be required on a case-by-case basis, with the specificity of some of the ethical decisions that have to be made about the application. That's going to be a lot of work. So Stu, you've done some work earlier on scope of CDO responsibilities and put out an article, I think one of the very first that had been written, about the authority and the mechanisms that CDOs will be using. At that time, we're starting to build strategies. And of course, we've just come out of a couple of days of a lot of examples being about the scope of responsibility. So if we're working in, and you've done lots and lots of work over the years on applications and complex data, if we're starting to encounter a lot of these, could you give us some your thoughts on how that is going to be efficiently organized within a CDO office and the partnership base? This could be a lot of things, right? A lot of stuff.
Well, I'm gonna use that opening to really address two issues, if you don't mind, Jim. One is something we've decided to do starting this year's conference. For many of you who may not be aware of it, Richard Wang and myself and a bunch of others wrote an article a couple years back regarding the various roles the CDO may serve. And we have a three-dimensional cube, we called it. One had to do with whether the CDO is primarily looking internal within the company, or, as you mentioned regarding partnerships, looking externally to the company. We also talked about whether the type of data the CDO was mostly looking at was, I call the traditional data, the inventory and manufacturing data, or what I call the big data, a lot of the social media, for example, kinds of data. And we also looked about kind of what was the responsibility of the CDO. Was it largely to service the rest of the organization, or was it to be innovative and develop new strategies? The reason I'm bringing this up is we're going to ask all of you, if you don't mind, to participate in a little survey we're going to be doing at the end of the conference, trying to understand what is the current mixture of those characteristics. That's a little bit of a pitch for the survey we're going to do. But let me get back to Jim's particular question, which unfortunately is a bit off the rails in some sense. That the problem is that the issue that we're trying to address has not really been on most people's radar. It is a kind of think of it as another dimension. Maybe we need a fourth dimensional cube to deal with it. And the reason why I say that is, as some of you may know, I'm also doing a lot of work regarding cybersecurity. And the reason why I say that is the trouble is we think as human beings, as engineers, as scientists, about systems in terms of how we think they should work. The thing we need to think about is how they could work, whether it be a hacker making our system do something that we did not intended, or as Steve pointed out, the AI system misrecognizing something or misbehaving because we never thought of the possibility of it doing that. And how do we either A, anticipate those things better, or B, mitigate those issues? What I'm trying to suggest here, this is a whole new world of challenges. And in many ways, the CDO, I think, is a key player in helping organizations move forward on it. Maybe Steve has some further thoughts about that.
Yeah, and I think this, and I'm going to quote some of the work from your paper. At the end of the day, this is like what the CISOs have had to deal with over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
This is a risk determination.
Yeah.
And so when you look at these kind of biases or threats to AI systems, or having a problem where you have an AI that's going to make life or death decisions versus an AI that's going to tell you what shirts are in fashion, you as a developer and an integrator of these solutions, you're going to make a risk determination of how important is the decision making of this AI, and is AI the appropriate solution based on the risk? But then also, when you go into those risk calculations, is understanding the building blocks for that AI. How risky is the data sets that you're using? How risky is the model? Where did the supply chain come from? Did you get them from an open source? Did you get it from a provider? Did you do the training yourself? Those all go into a risk calculation. So I think one of the things that we absolutely should see is the CDO evolve into a risk organization, just like the CIO office has, just like compliance and legal has. understanding the risks of the use of data and the use of the AI technology so that you can then apply those metrics back to their application. This will drive the data governance strategy. It will also drive the risk mitigation, because if you go back to what Stu was showing there, the trolley experiment, or the modern version of the trolley experiment, at the end of the day, you're making a risk calculation as a developer on what should be the appropriate outcome. It doesn't have to be life or death. I'll take the smart factory as a great example. A decision about what is considered to be a defect could greatly affect the yield of a factory, and how much weighting, what's considered, what's the tolerance that you're willing. Those are risk calculations. Our AI and our data analytics and our machine learning have to be able to build those in. So we need to build that capability into the AI so that that influences the weighting, influences the decision. And ultimately, when you get those insights, recognizing that if it says go left or go right, there's a weighting behind that. It's not 100% one or the other. There's a percentage. And so that has to fit into your ultimate risk categorization, not just what drove the AI, but the outcomes itself needs to be put back into a risk calculation of what do I do with this information? Now, in a real-time scenario like the trolley experiment, you don't have a whole lot of time to make a decision. But when you're doing business insights or operational efficiencies, you can use the weighting and the risk scores to make better decisions, because that's ultimately what you've got to do here.
Let me use an example that possibly many of us have run into, involving GPS systems in cars, which in many ways is a kind of AI system of sorts, a relatively modest one, and I call unintended consequences. How often has it taken you, particularly if you're in an area you roughly know about, how often has it taken you in a direction that is not what you'd consider to be optimal? Whatever criteria it used, it thought it was the best way to go. Your knowledge has, so the reason I bring this up, because more and more I think we're going to find AI systems and human systems working together. Because a lot of times the AI system will find a shortcut you never knew about. That's called the good news. In one case, the AI system took me to a totally bad section of town I really didn't want to be in. That's called a bad decision. And so we have to realize that they are making decisions just like we do. Just like we can make flaws, they can make flaws. And we have to be conscious about that, as you said. It is a risk process that's going on that the CDO, which is probably not necessarily a responsibility they've had in the past, but I think really have to rise to the occasion.
If I could add one thing to that, in that scenario, is the other thing that people often forget is that you've got multiple stakeholders. And so if we take the Waze or the GPS example you have there, you may not be the actual stakeholder. What if the traffic, if they make a decision that if they divert 20% of traffic a slightly slower route, they make it better for 100,000 more people to get home on time. We have to recognize that a lot of times AI are making decisions for more than just ourselves. We're part of a community or part of a different stakeholders that are ultimately driving what the weighting and what the decision making was done. We see this a lot of when looking at the sort of supply chain logistics, where you've got multiple stakeholders, sometimes competitive stakeholders, all relying on the same data, but using their AI to make decisions about what to do at a given time. Oftentimes it doesn't give everyone the optimum outcome, but it gives a collective, and that was a decision made at its design time. So recognizing that the user of the AI may not be the actual stakeholder that's going to get the ultimate benefit, or at least not the only one.
Yeah. One of the points I also think mentioned in that article is really, as a society, we need to think about what we believe. The analogy I used is that there are many circumstances where people, quote, who have accidents. They drive a little too fast, they happen to hit someone and so on. And usually we consider those to be accidents, and we kind of say it's sad and it's unfortunate, but they didn't do it on purpose, so we excuse them. My point is, if an AI system did, quote, an accident like that, would we be as forgiving? And why is it that we would forgive you or me for doing such a thing, but we wouldn't forgive the AI system? I don't have an answer to that, but I think this is a social issue, an ethical issue. As a society, we have to decide. Because there have been examples or analysis, because I hate to say it, there's a lot of automobile accidents happen every single weekend, every single day. And there have been analyses that that AI systems in general could do a heck of a lot better than we do, but not flawlessly. Are we willing to accept their flaws in exchange for the amount of lives that end up being saved? I don't have the answer, but these are what I call the real challenging issues that get to the soul of our bodies.
So I'm hoping that I'm back. everybody see me? I apologize. We're having brownouts here in San Diego. So I think I encountered one, but hopefully I got back quickly. So apologies if I dropped off the screen there for a second.
Don't you have a hand crank electric system?
Sometimes it feels like that, Stu. So let me give you guys a heads up on the next question I want to ask about this. And let me, while you're thinking about that, let me pose two industries that worry a lot about risk and have priced risk, and you're both aware of them. So what I'm going to ask is teams, kind of what kinds of team skills are going to be needed in the future AI organization. If you're going to put together a development team, which Stu, you mentioned, who's going to be on the team? And is the team down there and they're making something and then they give it to somebody else, or how's that going to work? So let me give you a quick example. So the insurance industry has been long associated with pricing risk, right? We've gone through shipping, aviation, AI in some sense isn't that new in aeronautics. Jimmy Doolittle, who was an MIT graduate, was the first guy who flew under a hood in 1927 in aeronautical engineering, had a Ph.D. in engineering from the Institute. Military, of course, is addressing questions of who do we direct drone to pretty much every day. So there is at least some models out there about how AI in very close decision parameters and or extreme circumstances with a lot of results, impact, I should say, are there. So is that a model that we would look at in the context of a team skill development and a process or procedure about how we're going to implement? Stu, let me throw that to you first.
Well, firstly, I agree with you. And many organizations, you mentioned the military, tend to maybe have a deliberate risk assessment. I don't think that's something that all organizations do or do particularly well. And so I think that is a skill that organizations need to develop much more of. One of the other challenges, which is even more challenging, I find, particularly with AI systems, there's often a confrontation between time to market that is getting the system done and thinking about the risk the system may be encountering. And so this is almost at a higher level trade-off in an organization. So I think both things have to be done. I think we need to be consciously aware that the systems we're developing have consequences, and that we need to think about those consequences, even though in some cases it may slow down the speed to market. Now, not everybody will agree with me on that matter, but I think that is a major change in the way many organizations operate that's going to be so important. Steve, do you want to give your view?
If I can echo Steve from the early 2000s, when I was talking cybersecurity and talking about how we can't bolt cybersecurity on after the fact, it's got to be built in. And if we continue to let time to market trump security, we will have insecure systems. We're here again, except to take out the word security, put in AI and risk for AI. It's the same, we're running into a lot of the same challenges. Risks can be introduced early in the life cycle. You can't wait till you're done training your model and deploying it before you've figured out what risks there were for bias or perturbation in the data sets or lack of integrity, because by then it's way too late. There's this, some of my AI experts like to use this model. For every bad piece of data, it takes 2 pieces of good data to bring the model just back to normal, not to make it good again, but just to undo the bad. It's an oversimplification, but if you look at a lot of the deep learning training sets, that's the typical model they use. Once you've built your model, you're way far down the process to try to go back and figure out, well, how can we fix it? So introducing and understanding risk at the development and design stage and understanding how you're building that AI system is absolutely important. And again, just like in security, because we know that time to market will trump most things, unless we make it a foundational requirement that we can trust this AI and that this AI has got the proper, whether it be ethics or decision risk modeling built in, we will never get a trustworthy AI system, because ultimately time to market will trump it every time.
Okay, so guys, I think at this point, we've got about 20 minutes left in the session, and I'm starting to get questions from our participants, some of which are quite provocative. So you guys have touched some questions. So let me get going on those. And some of them are comments, and then some of them are specific questions. So let me just identify a couple of comments, and then we'll get to some specifics. One of the comments has been that as an identification of kind of who will have the responsibility, and the comment reads, the person writing the code is too far down the decision pyramid. Management is leaving developers to guess at safe outcomes. And that's a question. It sounds like data is at the core of ethical AI. Does a company wanting to manage ethical AI need solid data glossaries, in your case, data quality, basically understanding and have a deep knowledge of the data? And let me just do one more point and then we'll stop. You guys can respond to these. Will people accept accidents from AI? I think the answer is a clear no. Is that logical?
Well, I mean, let's face it, by definition, it's not logical, but that's human nature. We are willing to accept a lot of faults from humans, as Stu mentioned, and none from our machines, because we have this unrealistic expectation that machines don't break, or machines are always right. And it's unrealistic. I mean, your computer crashes on it used to crash a lot worse. It does happen. Cars have faults and the brakes stop working. But people, when it comes to AI, for some reason, they have this intrinsic belief that the AI is binary. It's either right or it's wrong. There cannot be a fault. And so we are subjectively applying a level of an unachievable bar to the AIs, because there are going to be mistakes in both the design, the development, and even in the algorithms as they start to learn, and they can mislearn things. It happens. Bits can get flipped. But I think that, as Stu mentioned earlier, even if we could save 80% more lives if we all went autonomous, and there would still be 20% would still people would still die, you're going to find that subjectively people are not comfortable with that, even with the life saved. And this is something we've struggled with in the AI marketplace, is as we start to bring AI closer and closer to life decisions in medicine, in autonomous vehicle, in military and other use cases, our comfort level a lot of times changes along that. I mean, we are okay if the AI for a purchasing system recommends something that you'd never want to buy, you just ignore it. But if it recommends the prescription drug that's going to save your life for cancer, you're going to have a different gut reaction to that.
That reminds me. First, I think you're bringing up the key point, Steve. Society at whole needs to rethink a lot of these issues. But Jim, many years ago, I took a course from Professor Marvin Minsky, who many people know was one of the founders of artificial intelligence back then. And there were two things he said that were very provocative. He'd often go out and be invited to give talks to visiting groups, or particularly faculty wives and so on. And the two things he would say was, number one, people are just computers made out of meat. But the more provocative one, he said, the real problem you have to worry about is, what are you going to say when your daughter comes home and say she's dating a robot? And so we're not quite there yet, but as a society, we're getting closer to hitting some of these really emotional issues. And by and large, I think we're very unprepared.
So one of the comments we have is pertinent to that discussion. It's a comment and a question kind of embedded within each other. The question is, well, let me rephrase it slightly to clarify and put into context with what you have been presenting. So there's the range of things we can do, could, and then there's the range of things, the question is should. And so what this person is saying is, how do we balance, who is going to, maybe two parts. Sue, you've identified kind of a social construction around should. How does that social construction go to organizations which have the could part of this question?
Well, I'll try to give a response, and I want Steve to add in as well. I think in many ways there are multiple layers. I raise the issue here. It's both ethical issues, there are legal issues, there are business issues, and they're not always aligned with each other. And so, in some sense, the way in which the corporate executives have to weigh the pros and cons and the trade-offs may not be the same way that society at large does. Now, to the extent to which we can get them to be harmonious, that's a win, but that's not always the case. Steve?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of ways to come at that. I want to give 2 points. One is ethics are transitive. So depending on who's asking the ethical question, you're going to have very different answers. Our society may have one ethical determination around the use of a technology, and you go to a different country or a different subculture, you'll get a completely different answer. So ethics for who? So when you start saying should we or could we, it's should we or could we for who and with which environment, and you're going to get very different answers. There isn't, as you like to say in your paper, there isn't a right answer when humans disagree. The other thing to think about is that, we can have these ethical discussions about, how do we apply ethics to AI? But I think one thing to recognize is that, we can have these discussions, but it's not going to stop them from happening. We've seen this in other use cases. We've talked about this when the web and web services first came out. There was a paper I was a co-author of that was, so here are the 10 applications that should never be web enabled. Every one of them have been web enabled. Life or death situations, command and shoot application, all those things that we were talking about in the early days of web that was just, it was too susceptible to attack. They're all enabled. They're having conversations. Well, these are things that we should never AI enable. That ship has sailed, whether we like it or not. The question is, how do we build an ethical model that itself can be translated across multiple cultures? Because again, even within the US, there's going to be differences of opinion on what the appropriate AI ethics. So is there a way that we can help build a learning model or an AI for ethics to understand what the right ethical decision is for a given context? And those are some of the challenges for research community to take a look at. And I think one of the things it does is it brings together a variety of different disciplines that maybe have never talked to each other. Ethicists, data scientists, humanities, legal, compliance, bringing them together to have those kind of conversations to both understand the ethics, understand the mechanisms, but also think about practical implications of how would you do something like that. But I think asking the question of should we or could we, I mean, you can go look out there right now. That ship has so sailed. AI is literally everywhere.
So here's an interesting comment that we just received, and I'll just do a time check. We've got about 12 minutes left. So in about 2 minutes, I'm going to flip to some takeaways, some suggested takeaways from our session as we introduced at the beginning. So one of our participants identified that a favorite AI risk view is actually personal choice metrics as opposed to institutional. And he or she wrote, so when you get in your car, you could choose from multiple AI options, and you would simply indicate to the car AI system, save the driver, save the pedestrian, and that would then move from the model of an institutional control, policies, all this kind of, the mechanism and the process for decision making from an institution to, well, we'll provide the option set to the, so the level of, so in an aeronautical example would be, how much automation am I going to fly my plane by today? How would you guys respond to the notion of personal control of AI options as opposed to institutional controls?
Well, let me answer that in two parts, if you will. One, it brings up a whole nother set of issues regarding responsibility. So getting back to my car example here, if the car did something you didn't like, in the end, who do you sue? Do you sue the owner of the car or the quote driver who really wasn't driving it? Do you sue the manufacturer? Do you sue the programmer who designed it? You can sue the CDO who provided the data set. So that's an interesting issue regarding responsibility. But what you've done is partly solve the issue by saying, can you, in some sense, transfer that responsibility to the driver in some sense by saying, well, rather than figure whatever the algorithms were, he will tell the system what to do. The trouble is, of course, it's not clear that most drivers or whatever the operator is is fully aware of what all the possible decisions the system might make. So it might work in some cases, but it might not work in all cases. But it is an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and I would add two things. I would add one, that generally in societies we don't trust individuals to make good decisions. So the pass the buck to the individual has never worked in broad strokes. The other thing to keep in mind, this is something I've used this response to some of the other trolley experiments conversations I've had, is there's a fourth option that no one ever talks about. And that is, insert a random number generator and have the computer just spit out a random 1, 2, or 3 at that moment. This way, no one ever has to make a decision. The AI can basically just say, I give up. I've got 3 bad scenarios, randomly pick one. And so let chance be the
Blame it on
determinant.
quantum physics.
Yeah. But I think when you look at the challenge there around personal choice versus societal choice, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that there's a lot of stakeholders involved in these systems. And I don't think that in all cases, especially in the case of Tesla as an example of an autonomous vehicle provider, absolutely doesn't want to give the individual driver, because again, they have a PR stake in making sure that the Tesla doesn't run over moms with babies. And so I don't think that anyone who believes that they actually own the choice in an autonomous vehicle, that they're the only stakeholder, is missing the point that there's a broad community involved, both society, there's government legal requirements, safety requirements, and ultimately, even the manufacturer. And then they're all making these decisions based on liability as well. So in a lab experiment, you could say personal choice should supersede. In the real world, I think it's too complex to say one or the other.
So I think we've accomplished our objective of taking a topic and expanding on the dimensions. And let me just close this part of it, and then we'll move to takeaways by just a quick comment or two that are consistent and reflect kind of what you're saying. So one of, I think, what I'm understanding you to be identifying is we have a social contract, and our technologies are becoming so powerful that we're now not thinking just of functionality within an organizational setting. We're expanding those to some kind of a social contract. That seems clearly a suggestion that you're making. We have institutions, of course, that are trying to define that. We have legal theory, we have laws, we have and policies. And of course, corporate policies are one set of actions for behaviors and decision-making within the company. And then of course, we have social organizations and governance organizations that expand that to the area of social contract. So it may be that we're coming into, and one of the comments here was that it's going to be very important to develop best practices and identify what those practices are, and maybe identify some of the social elements in those contracts and how best practices can contribute to that. But let me now transition just in terms of time. We got about 9 minutes left. We spoke about the session beforehand, and we knew that we would be expanding this, and we felt that at the end we would come back and make sure that we had some very specific takeaways, both learning and identifying what some specific takeaways that our participants could think about. So, so Steve, let me go to you first on those, and then Stu, you'll close it, and then I'll do a formal close. So Steve, over to you.
So I think just to echo some of the themes we've been talking about today, I think there are a couple of things that are important takeaways. One is that it's going to take an ecosystem. It's going to take collaboration to deploy these things correctly. And so that's both in from the design, the development of the systems, to the deployment and the whole life cycle. And so while the CDO may be the central hub with their data architects and the data science, and they may drive a lot of the policies, it only works if you work together, both within your organization and also with your supply chain and your partners, where you're getting your data. If you've got to collaborate and build that sort of whole ecosystem approach to building trustworthy and reliable AI. If you haven't yet, you need to define a CDO role within your organization, whether it be an official title or someone who's going to take on those responsibilities, because you got to have that one throat to choke. You have to have someone who's going to be the owner of those policies and implementations. And then again, it's that we have to start looking at and driving the requirement for building in these risk mitigation and risk scoring capabilities throughout the life cycle. We've got to get transparency into what that supply chain is. We have to demand that we get better results out of our data sets so that we know what we're getting when we take them down. Even having the knowledge of what a model was trained with. There are lots of open source model zoos or sites where you can get existing models with no visibility into what data sets train them, which leads to a lot of the bad outcomes. By having it be a requirement that you get access to the data or get the metadata to understand what those data sets were comprised of is the first steps towards trying to build a trustworthy AI system. So just to really bring it all together, it's, you need to have a single authority who's going to help drive the policy, but they cannot work in a vacuum. They've got to work together with the broader ecosystem. And then we've got to demand better around our AI systems, or we're never going to get to where we need to get to. So we can start to ask these more interesting ethical questions. We've got to have a foundation upon which to even trust the AI in the first place. Stu, over to you.
Okay, well, I'll two points. One, I think, and this is true in many other sessions we've heard in this conference, data is so important, whether it be for AI systems or for lots of other purposes. And therefore, many organizations either do not have CDOs yet, or the CDO is not necessarily being given or is involved enough in the important decisions. And I think that's very important. As Jim may know, for about 30 years, we've been looking at the issue of data semantics and doing a better job of understanding data semantics. I hope we've made some progress, but for 30 years, the progress is unfortunately minuscule. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for CDOs to really help in that one. But the one I want to kind of piggyback on what Steve said as well, agree with him. I think this whole notion of risk assessment or risk management is something that's way underseen in organizations. It's not just the CDO, but I think the CDO is a key point there. We have done a number of case studies in the last couple of years looking at essentially bad things that have happened in organizations of all kinds. And almost always I say what's happening is semi-conscious decision-making. That is, decisions were made. No, we will do X or we will do Y or we will not do X or Y, whatever decision, a decision was made, but nobody sat down and said, what are the possible consequences of that decision? And that, unfortunately, the magnitude of the bad things that happen keeps getting larger and larger. We can't keep doing things that way. We have to pause long enough to really understand or better understand the consequences of the decision we're making. That, I think, is going to be the biggest challenge. It's not just the CDO, but I think the CDO is in the center of a lot of that and maybe is a place where a lot of that can start to develop.
So Stu, thank you for closing on that note. I think that's precisely where we wanted to end up. We took a challenge to put this session together. I want to thank both you and Steve. These are difficult problems and they're emergent problems. And they're things that we need to think about as we go forward. And I hope that I want to thank you guys. I formally thank Stuart and Steve for taking this on. It's been a very important session. I want to thank all the participants who sent in comments, and I want to apologize. We had a lot of them, and I wasn't able to get to everyone. But we hope that in the compilation of those, we got to as many of them as made sense with respect to the specific themes that we were trying to talk. If we need a continuing discussion, please get in touch with any of us. We're very happy to discuss this topic. This is an active area of work, as Stu has noted, and as Steve has noted. So I think that will conclude the session. Thank you all very much. I want to thank those, we have support team here who supported this session. Thanks to them. Thanks to Elizabeth for the introductions at the very beginning.